All right, so yeah, so it's noon here, and it seems like we're all mostly here and ready to go. So yeah, I'd just like to start by saying good afternoon and welcome everyone to the BC Museums Association webinar. My name is Adrian Parody. I'm going to be the host today. Your usual host for webinars, Anissa, unfortunately couldn't be here, so I've kind of stepped in. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to learn and live here in mutual respect and appreciation. I'd also like to recognize that the traditional lands of many of the nations across BC where the work, the projects being described here today of this webinar are being carried out. So today's webinar is taking a slightly different approach to usual ones. Today it's more of an open discussion about Indigenous cultural heritage. And BCMA is pleased to present this webinar in partnership with our colleagues at Heritage BC. And once again, this webinar is sponsored by Lucidia. So as I mentioned, my name is Adrian Parody. I'm the BCMA's Communications Coordinator. And if you're having any technical difficulties with this webinar, please call or email our office, and Vanessa, our operations manager, is there standing by to help you out with any issues you might be having. Very briefly, housekeeping before we begin. If you're reading this slide and hearing me talk, we're doing great, everything's working well. If you can't, please call the office immediately so we can get that worked out. And just about the bit of the format of the webinar today, we've solicited questions in advance that we'll begin with. But if you have any questions or comments for Karen or Angie during the webinar, you can submit them to the chat box, and at the end, if we have time, we'll try and address a couple of them. But I suspect that we'll have info to go over, so we'll have to sort of see how that works out. Yeah, and that's really all I have. Just those sort of very brief notes. So if yeah, I guess without further ado, I'd like to introduce Karen Aird, Angie Bain, and Lou-Ann Neel, who is our moderator today. And just so that they can introduce themselves in their own language and their own words, I will pass it off to them.
My turn?
Yeah, I believe that's you now.
There we go. Oh, my screen changed. Mama Lila Clat, Lua Quagil. La Amkhan, Rila Castla, La Quangan, Le Hilkela Gachens, Hans Gachela Hoch, Await Naguisas. So, what I've said in my language of Kwakwala is welcome to everybody who's here today. My English name is Lou-Ann Neel. One of my names in my language is Ikatwega, and I'm from the Mamalitakla and the Kwagil people of the Kwakwakiwak. And I also acknowledged and thanked the Lekwungen people for always making us feel so welcome in their home territories. And I'm going to be your moderator today, so I'm really going to be just sharing some of the questions that were sent in advance of this webinar, and a couple of other questions if we have time. And as Adrian pointed out, we'll get to the questions that come across the chat as we can. I have a feeling too that we're going to need several more hours of discussion after today's webinar. So I'm just going to ask Karen first to introduce herself, followed by Angie.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Aird, and I'm actually talking to you from Tukanlus to Secwepemc, which is Secwepemc Ulu, Secwepemc territory. And I'm actually a visitor here. We have one of our First Peoples Cultural Council offices actually at Tukanlus to Secwepemc. I'm from Soto First Nations in Northeast BC, and we are Cree, Soto, and Dunizaw people all sort of mixed together now. And my family is the Dejeuner Phuket family and Camerons. So I've been privileged to work in cultural heritage for quite a long time, for about 25 years, first as an archaeologist and now in the heritage sector, urban planning. I'm the president also of the National Indigenous Heritage Circle and also the Heritage Manager for the First Peoples Cultural Council. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Karen. Angie.
Hi, everybody. Angie Bain, Intlakatma Tutsutkin. My name is Angie Bain. I'm Intlakatma, or Interior Salish, from a little reserve called Zut in the Nicola Valley. I'm from Merritt area, Lower Nicola Indian Band, and I currently live and work in Vancouver with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. I'm a researcher, about 20 years of research experience, a lot of it for my community, and a lot of heritage issues kind of intersect with the work that I do. I am on the board of directors with Heritage BC. I am on the advisory council for Research Ethics BC, and I have had some experience with rights and traditional knowledge through opportunities I've had. So I see it all intersecting in the heritage field. And welcome everybody, and I'm glad you could join us today.
Thanks, Angie. So that's a really great segue into one of the first questions, and this actually is a compilation of several questions that were asked. So what we want to do is get each of you to talk about what Indigenous cultural heritage means or what it includes, and the work you're doing in this field in response to what Indigenous cultural heritage means and includes. Karen, can I ask you to start? I have a frozen picture in my screen. How about while Karen's screen unfreezes, Angie, can I get you to respond to that?
That's unfortunate for you all because I know Karen can give a better definition of Indigenous cultural heritage than me. But for myself, it really means those things that are broader than our typical definition of heritage. It includes things like our songs and stories, our dances, our names, our place names, those things that are sacred, part of what makes us unique as a people and a culture. So for my community, it's all that and more. It's also those tangible things, so the cultural heritage materials that we see around us within our communities and in memory institutions. It's all encompassing, and it's very hard, I think, when you're from a community to separate the intangible from the tangible.
Absolutely.
My background, I guess from my community, we did a cultural heritage policy a few years ago, and we articulated the things that we feel are important and a part of our heritage. And that's something that we've been trying to give out to proponents as they want to undertake work within our asserted territories. So we provide a copy of it. It's on the web and readily available. You can do a Google search, Lower Nicola Indian Band Cultural Heritage Policy, and you'll find a copy of it. But that's how we try to share the message of what heritage means to us.
Excellent. Karen, looks like we have you back.
I know, sorry about that.
That's okay. So can you talk to us about cultural heritage?
For sure, yeah. I was saying that we many years ago with Indigenous Heritage Circle, we started with 2 roundtables, one in Vancouver and one in Ottawa, to really try to understand how Indigenous people were understanding heritage and cultural heritage. And it was such a complex discussion because what's evident, and we know this as Indigenous people, is that everybody's heritage is unique and distinct. So from here to, from say in my territory, Soto, to even the Daniza or to Algonquin territory in Ontario, there's going to be different traditions and different interpretations of what is Indigenous heritage. So over the years, we ended up doing 2 other roundtables with Parks Canada in Gatineau and Calgary, and we came up with what I feel is a fairly solid definition, as much as we can have a definition of Indigenous cultural heritage. And what we found out from all these discussions and roundtables was that the closest translation is often related to the sacred or to knowing oneself. And Indigenous people describe heritage according to their own perspectives, traditions, and languages. But it generally includes ideas, experiences, worldviews, objects, forms of expression such as language, practices, knowledge, spirituality, kinship ties like genealogy, places, and land valued by Indigenous peoples. And each of these concepts is interconnected and holds intrinsic value, intrinsic importance to the well-being of the future of Indigenous peoples. So you really can't extract one without the other. So language is completely connected to heritage. Place names and stories are embedded throughout. So it's very different than settler heritage, and it's very complex, and it's, of course, includes living heritage, which is intangible heritage. And there is really no protection for that at the national or provincial levels. So it's been quite a challenge, you know, not only getting the understanding, but also get the protection and safeguarding of it.
Fantastic. Yes, I run into that a lot in the arts world, where all of the arts are also segmented into different genres, even though they're all inherently interconnected and multidisciplinary. So I think that's a really good start to get us going around. One of the questions that came up several times also was around how to connect with the correct or the appropriate Indigenous representatives, especially when you have several First Nations or Métis or Inuit communities in the area where you live. How do you go about doing that? Can I ask Angie to start, just giving some advice or guidance around how people can start that process?
I think it's an excellent question, because it shows that you appreciate the differences between our communities. And for us, that is very important. And I think that acknowledging that at the very start goes a long way when you want to engage with communities. Through UBCIC, we do a lot of work with communities in British Columbia, and we do land claims research, but it touches on all sorts of things. So we still have that first engagement issue. And I think that the best way that we've ever been able to approach this engagement is to find the right, first of all, you got to do the background work and understand who it is you're trying to communicate with. So you can't go in and say, so I heard that the Lower Nicola Indian Band has an office somewhere in Merritt. You know, you have to do the work. You have to understand the history of the people who you want to work with. And then, once you've done the background work, reach out to your networks. So Karen has been a tremendous resource to me over my career, as well as quite a number of other people. So if I'm not familiar with the community, one of the first things I do is get in touch with my network and say, hey, I'm interested in working with this community. Can you point me in the direction of somebody to talk to? You have to be pretty clear about what it is you want to do and why. And if your network is a strong one, they will help to make sure you're not going in the wrong direction from the start. So they'll make sure that you ask yourself those questions you should be asking. And is this something that is beneficial to the community? Is it my project, or is it a project that will benefit us both? Those are the kind of things you should ask even before you get in a community. Mm-hmm. And then quite often you will reach out and you might get the wrong person at the start. But I think the more times you visit a community, the better chances you are of making the right connections with the right people. And the one thing I always say is look around the room, see who's not in the room, think about why they're not in the room, and think about how you can get to them. Because I think that's the question people tend to forget.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Angie. Karen.
Yeah, that's really good, actually. She kind of answered everything. The only thing I add to that, Angie, was that when you begin that background work of thinking about how you're going to engage, I really, really recommend, I call it an audit. I think you need to understand your history with Indigenous people, your own history, your bad history as an organization, or your good history, but your past relationships and what went wrong, and perhaps if you're looking at what happened there, interpretation, or how that history was reported by who. So I think that really needs to be examined carefully before you begin the process of sort of reaching out. And I think that you also have to look at who was interpreting that history. Who was that person at that time with that sort of historical narrative? How was it done? And I really also want to recommend you no expectations. Don't go in there expecting people to make a decision right away. Don't expect people to be on board with the project right away. I think you need to come in there with some clear objectives, but I also think you have to start slow because relationships take time, and it's a matter of building trust. And I know that it's very complex, but I think there's a benefit to taking the time to do that. I also really like the idea of, like, I'm often guided by, for my work, by a board of directors, but that board of directors is that I consider expert in this area. And I'm also fortunately going to be guided by a committee of that I consider experts, Indigenous heritage experts, who Angie is now part of. So I have this great committee, and I really rely on these people. And I really wish that the rest of the provinces and territories could do that as well. I think that there's, it's hard to find those people, those knowledge keepers that have the connections and the respect. You're looking for people with the respect and that do things the right way. So I really believe in finding those people and forming a good relationship and helping them, getting them to guide what you're doing. I think that's really critical. And I also believe that, you would fund experts, so you could fund knowledge keepers and people that are going to show up. That's their time, that's their energy. They have families, they often have to leave their grandchildren or children. So I think you have to be realistic about people's time and what they're able to provide and how much that would cost as well for them.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. And I think that I was asked this many years ago when I worked with the Indigenous Affairs Ministry, how come nobody answers my emails or my faxes when we used to use faxes, or the messages I leave? And if people haven't met you in person, face to face, they're not as likely to return your call, because which would lead to our next question around numerous organizations wanting to connect. And if I can add a little point too about the value that you can place on being present in the community. Communities are always hosting gatherings, festivals, some host powwows. Those are really good opportunities. National Indigenous Peoples Day. These are all places where you can actually go and meet and just be part of the community. And I think that really goes a long way too. And part of what you're saying, Karen, around trust, you have to build the trust in order for those discussions to continue successfully. So moving on to the next question around, we've talked about connecting with the right people, but how do you then create meaningful engagement or strategies for meaningful engagement in the communities that you connect with? Angie, can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for me, it's some of the things that we've already mentioned. It's investing the time and actually going in and listening, and not going there to lecture or stand up and do a presentation. This is something our elders have told us time and again, is get up and greet people as they come in the room, sit down with them before you start talking about what it is you came to talk to them about. Spend that time with them. And in my community, we have a meal before we have the meeting. And that's the time when we visit, and people can ask questions and you can share. And often that relationship building is not about proving that yourself or your project. It's about down and making a connection with people. And so you might not even ever talk about heritage in the first few meetings, and that's as it should be. When people are ready to talk about your project, they'll let you know. So the biggest thing is to take that time.
Fantastic. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much what I would say too, except for I really think that people have to be cognizant of UNDRIP, and that Indigenous people are the owners, and they're the rightful owners of their cultural heritage, and that they have a right to protect it, to maintain it. If they so develop it, that's their decision. And I really think that you know, that's there's still a lot of learning around that. You know, when you're holding Indigenous people's information or their objects or their stories, I think I think you have to approach it like you've been holding it for the community, and you're going to support however the community decides to develop it. And that process may take years, right? So I really want people to step away from this idea of ownership. I really strongly believe and advocate for Indigenous people to be the owners and stewards of their own heritage. Unfortunately, and we'll get into this, there's never been the funding or ability for our communities to do that, but I'm hoping that'll come at someday near future.
Yes, we all keep hoping along those lines. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just go to a question that was later on our list, just because what you said about development, Karen, caught my attention. We had a question that came around about tourism. And I'm just going to read what the person asked, because I think that there's actually several things here. We have some really tough challenges in Indigenous tourism. One of the biggest challenges being faced has been ensuring that cultural resources are protected and the intellectual property of First Nations is respected commercially. So the first part of the question was, does the First Peoples Cultural Council, or any other organization I'll add, have a role to play in defining the rules of engagement for tourism? So Karen, can I go to you first on that one?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I would first of all answer by saying no, but I would say it in this way, that I'm very reluctant to say any community, any of our Indigenous communities, what and how they should do things. So I believe that there's a role for tourism in heritage, but I think it's up to the First Nations communities to define it and understand how they want to go about it, or even develop their cultural properties or material for that purpose. We do have, I would say we're starting to have a fairly good relationship with Indigenous tourism, and at a national level, I haven't really, with issues at a national level, we haven't really engaged with Indigenous tourism, just because it's so complex, just trying to get protection of Indigenous heritage. So our focus has been on getting funding, protection, and safeguarding, and sort of the economics of it all, like the development and stuff, hasn't really played a big part of the role. There's just not enough people to sort of do that. But one of the areas I'm really hoping that I see a collaboration with First Peoples and Indigenous tourism would be around training. I mean, training for our knowledge keepers and our people in our community, if they so decide to, provide interpretation of sites, or to work on different, cultural programs. So I see that as a potential opportunity. Going back to the question, I don't really see our role as developing a process or sort of dictating how a community would go about relating with Indigenous tourism or dealing with, appropriation. Appropriation is a big issue for us, and mostly our concern with First Peoples and with Indigenous people is to ensure that communities have a voice in that. Yeah.
Awesome. Angie, your thoughts on that?
I think that organizations can have a role in advocacy work, and I think that they can have a role in the networking side of that. But I agree with Karen in that the real work needs to be done in communities. I'm thinking of an example, a national example. When I was an intern, I worked in New Zealand, and I went to visit all of these places to learn about Maori culture. And it just was so apparent in a lot of places we went. But one of the most impressive for me was a place where there was a school, a carving school attached to this place where tourists could buy things made by the carvers themselves. And it wasn't the objects that were for sale that was really interesting for me. It was actually seeing people learning their art and teaching it and passing it along to different generations. And language was a huge component of that organization. And that's the kind of thing that I think if we could find those opportunities here in British Columbia, if we could find ways to support the work, the necessary work that we need in communities to pass along our traditions and culture, that we can really help.
Terrific. Yes, it is. That's a really huge area. And I'll say to BCMA, maybe we should have a separate discussion just on tourism, that there's so many different spring off discussions that can be had. And you're both, I think I agree with both of you around the need for our communities to be able to develop these things. But of course, the funding to create the positions, to have people working full time on these things, it always seems to elude us. So we'll keep advocating for those kinds of things. I think that on the tourism side of the question, going back to what we were talking about earlier around those relationships, it's really about relationships and being clear on what the community wants to do as their priorities in tourism. The next question has to do with Indigenous languages and the writing systems. Many people will know that pretty well every language in BC, all across Canada actually, has a different writing system. And the individual who wrote in asked if there was a way First Peoples could help to create or identify a writing system that can be more compatible with English, more readily usable and recognizable on the internet so that people can learn how to pronounce things. Can I get your thoughts on that, Karen?
Yeah, this is a really challenging question actually for Indigenous communities and for First Peoples Cultural Council. And it's a challenging one for us as we try to bring forth this revitalization effort across BC for Indigenous languages. As you know, many Indigenous languages do not have a standardized writing system. And that's due to a complicated history with linguists and priests and anthropologists that were working with their languages. And sometimes a community can have up to 6 different writing systems. So some of them use symbols and there's some frustration around it. And First Peoples has worked on supporting, the communities to develop their own systems, but honestly, some of our communities are very attached to their systems, and they're reluctant to change them. I know that the different symbols can be confusing too. So what we've done is we've supported the communities to make that decision on what they want to do with the writing systems. And we do try to encourage them to standardize them and agree on one system, but that still hasn't happened for a lot of our communities. And what we'll do is we'll work with museums, provide a guided writing system for each of the communities when requested. But again, it's up to the community to decide how they want their system to be and what it would look like.
Right. Thanks, Karen. Angie.
Thanks. I agree. I think that it really depends on the context that we're talking about using the language in. For something like, an official highway sign on the side of the road, like we've done after the Winter Olympics here in British Columbia, incorporating the language into some of the signage. I think it's important to get that right. And I think that taking the orthography, the symbols out of that would diminish the intent of what we were trying to do, I think, with those signs. So I think in that instance, I would be very strong and say, no, it's got to stay as the community wants it. I think that for some things, you don't lose as much as you might if you worked with the community to find a way to make it more digestible. So when I go to my community and I say, how do I say this? Because I'm a new language learner and I need to use the language in the work that I do. And they'll say, what is it you want to say? And I'll have these heritage terms, the language, the technical language that we use in the work that we do. And I'll say, I want to say this. And they say, well, can you say it this way? Because that's easier to say. And I think that if we work with communities in that way, we can still keep the heart of the language and the work that we do, but we can find ways to work together to make it something that others can understand.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best way, like Karen's saying, is working with communities. You can't make these decisions alone. It's very political. Language, I say, is one of the most political things that we have, but it is tied to our identity. It is tied to our title and rights. All of the fights that our ancestors and our future generations are going to have is tied to our language. So we can't simplify for the sake of simplifying.
I just want to add one thing. You know, I've seen some pretty interesting processes of trying to standardize even the name of your community, right? And it's, you know, one of the communities in the north where I'm from, Treaty 8, really had a hard time with their language. There was about 7 bands that were under this, use this one language, and this, gosh, it became challenging. One had one different reading system way of writing their language, and the other had another. But they formed an elders language council quite a few years ago, and it's been years of sort of going back and forth, and there's anthropologists that have really used this. Of course, once it's an academic text, it's hard to change it, but it has changed. It's become standardized. The name is now like one, it's used collectively amongst the 7 different groups, and but it did take a long time, and I think it was a really valuable process to get here, to having the elders, having their voices heard.
That's awesome,
Karen, because one of the things that I find in my community is if you ask them a question about the language, quite often our linguists or language speakers will consult amongst themselves. And I don't get my answer right away. It takes as long as it takes to discuss the appropriate word or phrase or spelling before I'm told what it is, because people want to be so careful with language. There's so few speakers in my nation, and so few who feel that confidence in it. So it's just as hard for us in our communities to spell these words and sometimes to pronounce them. I still, for the life of me, I cannot pronounce a lot of our words, but you got to try.
Yeah, and like so many of our words, like heritage is so linked to it, as we all know, like the place names, and have so much more meaning, as well as, you know, laws. A lot of our laws come from those oral histories, and the words can describe so much. So it's incredibly important work.
Ola Ella Ike. I think that you both just shine such light on all of this, and I think that and the point I would add is that these are oral traditions. These are oral languages. Languages are meant to be learned that way, and always being able or wanting to write it down is not necessarily what you're after. You do have to really think about, like what you say, Angie, depends on the context that these things are being asked. This question was more in relation to tourism and being able to give visitors this opportunity to understand and engage. But I'll share one very brief example. Every morning when I walk into work, we have a set of keys that we have to pick up from security. So I started to say, "Qela kasla," and the security folks started to ask me, what are you saying to us every morning? Now every morning, before I even get to the desk, they say to me, "Qela kasla." And so it was about just practicing and finding different ways to share the language. We've never written it down. They've never seen Qela kasla in writing, but their ear understands it now. Now, if I showed it to them, it would probably make sense. And I think we do have a lot of challenges. We've had the challenges for many years around the different writing systems. I think in some ways I see that as a bit of a red herring as far as what the problem is. The problem is we're not producing the speakers we need to produce in order to be able to translate into English so that visitors, for one, and also people who live as our neighbors can start to understand our cultures. So I'm going to switch gears here, well, not really switch gears, just take this a little further down the path around the kinds of educational and informational resources that both of your respective organizations have. And if I can get you to talk a little bit about what's there and how people can access and make use of it. Karen.
Okay, yeah, so we just actually, we've always had a mandate for revitalization, protection, safeguarding Indigenous cultural heritage with First Peoples Cultural Council, but we've never actually had any funding to support that mandate. So I was brought on in November, and we have quite a, we've developed a strategic plan, and one of the first things we're seeking is funding for grants in our community. And I'm very happy to say I obtained funding, and our first set of grants are going to be coming out in September. Yay! And it's not sustainable, but it's funding, so I'm very excited. I have funding for Sense of Place grants. They're going to be coming out, I think September the 18th, the date of the release, and we hope to have funds given to the recipients by like early November at the latest. So there's going to be, you can apply up to $25,000 for these grants, and it's going to have to demonstrate a connection between place and heritage, Indigenous cultural heritage, and revitalization as well. So the guidelines are just being finalized, and they'll be on the website soon. So I'm really hoping that everybody, you know, because part of this, even if we can't give out all the grants, the interest that we have in the grants, we can demonstrate the need for it. Because as we all know, there's a desperate need for it. And I know a lot of our communities are looking at place name projects and even, you know, helping look at commemoration of residential schools. There's a variety of things that are coming up, but that's very exciting. We also have micro grants coming up as well. So those will be less strenuous to fill out. They'll be basically, if you're interested in forming a heritage committee, or if there's travel for elders to go to heritage, something related to Indigenous heritage, then these micro grants can support that. So those are both coming out. And so that'll be really exciting. We also have about 9 projects on the go with the Heritage Project. And so one of them was to start this Indigenous Cultural Heritage Advisory Committee, which I mentioned earlier. Angie is now my appointed member, so I'm very excited. And I have a few others. And so these are people that are going to, I'm hoping, help me advocate and get funding for the organization. But we have other projects. One is decolonizing all of the heritage branches, policies, legislations, and programs. It's 17 of them. It's a big project. And I'm working with Dr. George Nicholas, as well as who's worked with the intellectual properties IPinch framework and on lots of other projects, and David from Solo Nation and some others as well. And so that work is really important for implementation of UNDRIP, which BC plans to do as well. So, yeah, and then the other one I have going on is I have 2 Indigenous roundtables on decolonizing heritage. One will be in Vancouver, and the other will be in Kamloops, and those will be in November. And the purpose of those will be to go over all of the work we've been doing at First Peoples for the last few months, the work on the policies and legislation, the work as well that I just completed a policy paper on Indigenous heritage. It's putting in solid recommendation. It's a provincial but national scope, and that'll be the purpose of that roundtable will be to review that, and as well as our work we're doing right now with UNESCO on the 2003 Intangible Heritage Convention. So those will be some of the focuses of this roundtable. And then we have several projects that we're working on as well with the Heritage Branch around just changing the Indigenous history of BC, looking at more inclusive, accurate, and authentic narrative for BC.
How exciting. Wow. Angie, tell us what UBCIC is up to.
Well, UBCIC, for those who don't know, we are a advocacy organization, political advocacy organization, and we developed a heritage toolkit. It was kind of to help communities who were struggling with those piles and stacks of paper that come into their office every day to deal around Crown land referrals. So anytime a proponent wants to go through your asserted territory, they need to notify your community what their plans are, and communities have X number of days, usually never enough time, to respond to these things. And so that heritage toolkit was to help communities respond to that. In the past, we've held meetings and workshops around related issues like traditional knowledge and intellectual property rights, which I think really ties into the heritage field. We have also, on the policy side, not my job personally, but others at UBCIC sit on committees and groups that talk about heritage policy. So the Union of BC Indian Chiefs is one of the 3 organizations in the province representing a good portion, I think most of our communities, either in treaty or not in treaty, around the heritage issue, specifically around potential changes to the language in the Heritage Conservation Act and the issues that we have with it as it stands now. And I think that work's been ongoing for quite a number of years. I'm privileged to be able to participate in these advisory councils and committees. So Karen mentioned I'm just joining First Peoples. I'm also with Heritage BC, the board of directors, so I use my time there to advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous voices, I guess, in that heritage conversation. And I think Heritage BC is doing something in the last couple of years, and I've only been with them for a little bit of time, but I've been really impressed because they've been out there questioning the mandate of the organization and trying to see ways where they could also be a part of the conversation around how do we deal with this issue of the non-inclusion of Indigenous heritage for so long, and how do we create that space and voice. And so I get to do fun things like help organize conferences and help give out money, which I think is, like Karen says, that's really what's needed in the community. So I guess that's really what I've been doing there. And then in my community itself, we take a very kind of personal approach. So we're the advocates for the Intlakatma out there. We got a RBCM Repatriation grant last year, and we got to go to a couple of different repositories. And while we're out there, we work with these places to help them understand us and our nation and our language and our heritage. So we're out there sort of doing the PR for our communities and helping people understand that there are, a dozen different ways to describe and say Intlakatma.
And of course, I have my own favorite way of saying that with lots of practice. I'm just noticing that our time is, we're down to about 15 minutes. Adrian, can I check in with you to see if there are any questions coming across the chat that we might want to address before we barrel towards the end here?
Yeah, definitely. There actually hasn't been any chat questions so far, I don't think.
Okay.
I guess, yeah, so if you guys wanted to continue on.
Okay, great. I do have a couple more questions that were posed from the advance emails. So switching gears again, there was a really interesting question that somebody posed around how to respectfully verify information that's being shared by community with folks such as historians, scientists, archaeologists who are required to document how they've researched and verified information. And so I think this is another really broad topic area, but if we can touch on that a little bit and share some wisdom around that, I think our viewers would really appreciate that. Karen, can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that Indigenous people have their own systems for internally within our communities for verifying information. A lot of our feasts and our social structures are based on that. So I think, that's something that you have to leave in the hands of the Indigenous communities to sort of verify that. And these systems have been around for forever and ever, right? For thousands and thousands of years, they're highly structured in this, and that's why they try to engage in those new try to engage with the knowledge keepers that would be the caretakers of that information and would be responsible, you know, and try to understand. The other thing is I would recommend to look at OCAP, which is some principles that were developed for managing data, and it's ownership, control, access, and professional, it stands for. And you can go onto the AFN website, I think, and get information on OCAP. But it's really, it's a means for First Nations to control data collection and processes in their community. So I think that when you're talking about accuracy of information, you should really try to follow the principles set out in OCAP. Angie, do you want to say something else about OCAP, or, you know?
Yeah, I think that I don't want to say something else about OCAP, but I do want to say something else about this issue. I think that it's important that we recognize that every community has diversity, just as any society has diversity. And when we are concerned about things like validity of information, we got to just acknowledge that a paper document, a book, an oral recording that we have in our files, they're just as one-sided perhaps, that they're a perspective. They're one understanding of an event or a history, just as you talking to me would be. And so I think that, that it's not, for me, it wouldn't be a question about how do I validate, how do I ensure I got the most accurate story from Angie's community. I would ask, how do I ensure that I've got that range and understanding of Angie's community? Because as a woman, I might have a perspective. As a grandma, I have a perspective. You know, as somebody who's worked in heritage, I understand things a different way. And each of us has our own understanding and skills. And I think where I've seen people get into trouble in the past is when they're too hasty to latch on to that friendly person in the community who's, you know, maybe the first one who's willing to talk to them when they go in, and they become their expert and go-to person for everything. And I'm not a basket maker, so I cannot tell you how we make our baskets, right? And so you've got to look for that diversity and voice, I think, within the community, and understand when the community is telling you something, even if they're not saying it, because quite often they will. And so don't rush ahead in those kind of things. One of the things that I always do with any project I do with my community is I meet with them before we start to explain what we're doing. I meet with them throughout the project. I meet with them after the project to say, this is my understanding of what you told me. And then I meet with them again if I got it wrong. So I think that if you're looking for a way to make sure the signage you're putting up in your museum or the display you're putting up is correct, really it's about that time. Keep going back, keep asking questions, and recognize that things change over time.
Awesome.
I just want to add one thing.
Sure, Karen.
I just want to add one thing. In my community, there's been a challenge internally with the understanding of how the people migrated from Manitoulin Island. So that's a contested history internally amongst yourselves, but we've all agreed to disagree. So it doesn't mean that anybody's version is more accurate than the others. So there's a lot of different versions of it. But we all agree that they came out from a certain area, and they're interesting. Over the years, it's become more about an understanding that there's these different perspectives, and that we have the oral histories of the migration from many of our elders. There's been a few short sort of reports written on it, but right now, as a community, we understand that this sort of diverse history is ours, and we're going to go forward with it, and we accept it that it may not be accurate to one family, and there may be missing, other viewpoints on it. You can live with different. I mean, as humans, we have a lot of challenges, a lot of differences, and we have to work.
I would like to add that there are implications to what we decide to celebrate and what we decide to recognize. And these implications can have a huge impact on communities, their own identity, and their ability to share that with the larger community. And for us, it can even mean when the province has looked at the history of the Nicola Valley, and they look at the places where we can overlap. So this kind of goes back to one of the earlier questions, when you have 6 or more communities, who you have to accommodate. I think that it's important to recognize each of those perspectives, because if you don't appreciate the differences and the uniqueness of each, you might tend to lump together. For us, if you called us all Nicola Indians, you would be putting in Okanagan and Lakatma and Stewart, who are no longer thought to be a tribe, a separate tribe. And if you put this all together like that, you are missing the identity and uniqueness of each of our cultures.
Oh, my mind's just racing now. Thank you. Down to last 8 minutes. So I just wanted to say, I think that your points are just so excellent, and what I heard both of you alluding to also is that I think what people need to also appreciate and recognize is that there was a time when pretty well the one point of contact in many of our communities was the band office. And this just simply isn't the case anymore, especially when you're wanting to connect with different people, understand different languages, all of these things we've been talking about today. Yes, there are still band offices, but there are also cultural centers, elders groups, youth groups, arts groups. And so there's a really different range of places you can go to, like Angie's saying, get those different perspectives. And what Karen's saying, looking at their different mandates, each of their mandates is going to really frame the kind of response they're going to give to you. So it's really important to look at various different perspectives, different points of view, and things that are very practical, but also things that are very policy or legislation driven. How are we doing, Adrian? We're just about ready to wrap up. Any other questions on the chat?
There is a question here, actually, if you think you have time to take one at least.
Sure thing.
Yeah, so the question from the chat here, Lorraine is asking to please expand on the funding experts and knowledge keepers protocol.
Funding experts and knowledge keepers protocol. Okay, well, it sounds like it's something that's not singular for sure.
Yeah,
Karen,
true.
can we ask Karen to start off on that one?
Are we talking about grant funding, do we think, that I was just mentioning? Is that what, yeah?
Yeah.
I think that might have been it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the funding that we're coming out with in September is going to, well, put on our social media in September, is that it's going to be for sense of place. So, I envision projects that are going to demonstrate revitalization of Indigenous people's connection between language and heritage to place. That's pretty open and broad. I know that. Protocols could potentially be under that, development of protocols, specifically like ancestral remains protocols and those type of protocols. We'll have a jury and it'll have guidelines, but there has been quite a bit of work actually done around that as well. I know a lot of communities are at different stages in that, and there's been some successful projects that have developed ancestral remains protocols, for instance, with the Secwepemc and other groups. So unfortunately, I think you'd have to reach out to those communities and see if you can get access to those protocols. I'm hoping I'm answering it right. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the question, expand on the funding experts and knowledge keepers and protocols. So that's quite a vast question. Angie,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I see that there was somebody also had another interpretation of that question.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll speak to that other interpretation. How much do we pay knowledge keepers for meeting with us and sharing their knowledge? And that's a tricky question. As Karen said, we need to acknowledge that our community cultural experts are giving their expertise just as any outside community member might be giving their expertise to us. So if we pay a technician a certain amount, we better be prepared to pay a community member the same amount. That's the point I think Karen made, and I would agree with that. With the work that I do, it gets kind of tricky because I do land claims work in relation to this. And we talk to the community before we go and explain that some advice that we got specific to our work was that we could give gifts, but we couldn't pay. And I think you might come across other situations where that happens. I think the real protocol we're talking about here is finding the way to show that you respect and appreciate the time and expertise that has been shared with you. And I think as long as you can find that way to do that, that works. Also be aware that our community members are consulted time and again and again and again, internally and externally. So I have a lot of work on the go with my community, and I have to balance the number of times that I go to the same people, because quite often our knowledge holders, they're a smaller group in my community, so I'm going to them again and again, regardless of the project. So we have to balance that out, and we try to make sure that we balance it between all families in our community, and men and women and youth. Don't forget the value of the voice of our children, because one of the things that I've learned is if you can get them interested when they're young, that really starts the conversation in the community, because they're going home and they're talking about that around the dinner table. And they're talking about it in school, and the teachers are getting interested, and then they have projects about it, and then they involve the elders. It comes full circle if you involve the youth.
Thanks, Angie. Thank you, Karen. It looks like we're down to our last 30 seconds or so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know that.
Oops. See how our eyebrows go up with the
Yeah.
audio sounds really funky, Karen.
Try again.
So I think we're going to have to wrap things up and just say thank you to Angie and to Karen for just sharing as much as you could jam into an hour. As you can see, this is something that we could probably spend the rest of today on and then some. I'm going to suggest that for BCMA members, let's keep an eye out and keep contributing ideas back to BCMA on what we can include in the annual conference and more webinars like this. I think that the association has been very responsive in this regard, and we really want to keep these conversations open. Adrian, anything else we need to do to close things off?
Nothing else specifically, I don't think. I guess it's like you say, I think we could talk about this endlessly, and so an hour seems to go by very quickly. But yeah, if nothing else, I just wanted to say I so enjoyed like sitting in on this, and we all at the BCMA, and I think everyone attending, can't thank you guys enough for your time participating here, and for your patience with the couple technical glitches we had in the beginning there. Yeah, just thank you so much, all of you and everyone who attended. It's been fantastic. So yeah.
Thank you for your help, Adrian. And so for those who might not have been able to attend today, is the webinar available on the website?
For anyone who, for any BCMA member, it'll be available on the website. And then for anyone who registered for the webinar as well, you'll get a direct link to the YouTube recording of it also. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, we will say Hala Kesla and Leila Kesla. Thank you both again for sharing so much of your expertise today. And I look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.